been a tough but hopeful budget. South Africa's Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba quoted everyone from Julius Nyerere to Theodore Roosevelt to Nelson Mandela to Humas Kela. But what do people in top positions in business feel about this budget? Now, joining me for this discussion, Joseph Busha, Investments Tabili Wonsi of the Black Management Forum. We also have Simodisa, the Managing Director of Simodisa, and Alan Makoki, the CEO of Saki. But first, let's take a quick look at some of the budget highlights. This is South Africa's budget in a nutshell. South Africa hopes to raise an extra 36 billion rand in taxes this year. It plans to cut back spending by 85 billion rand over the next 3 years. The big story this year is that VAT was raised for the first time since 1993, up to 15%. The top 4 income tax brackets will stay the same. Excise duty for motor vehicles will increase from 25% to 30%. Estate duty will now be 25% on estates worth more than 30 million rand. Luxury goods tax up from 7% to 9%. A big one is 57 billion rand towards free higher education over the next 3 years. 12.7 billion of this to help poorer students this year. Social grants for those who can't work go up 7%. 10 billion rand for drought and public infrastructure. And finally, a boost for entrepreneurs with 1.4 billion to support small business. In a nutshell, Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba admits there is still a 48.2 billion gap in the country's finance. He called it a tough but hopeful budget. There you are, tough but hopeful budget. Start off with you, Alan Makoki. How do you think your members, CEOs, top people in this country are going to be reacting tonight to this budget?
Look, I think that it's a balanced budget in the end because it's a very difficult situation, low growth, high GDP, debt to GDP growth, high deficits. In the end, you are going to have to find money from somewhere. And when you run a business, you can only grow your revenues or cut your expenses. The revenues are not necessarily growing, so you're going to go back and try and figure a way of how am I going to be balancing this thing. And therefore, the 85 billion over 3 years is probably the most reasonable thing that you could have done. You've got to increase taxes somewhere because it's not like you're going to get increased revenues from business or from personal income tax or from VAT. So a 1% is negative in the end, but somewhere, somehow, someone must pay some kind of tax. So it had to come somewhere, and I think that 1% is probably not good, but it's probably not too bad comparatively speaking as well. The one that we complain mostly about is the 52 cents per litre on fuel. We think that it's going to have a very negative, a very adverse inflationary effect. I think that the number is too high to move. 52 cents is quite high. And I think that that's the one that's not necessarily making us very, very, very happy. But overall, I think that it's a balancing act. And I think that a lot still needs to be done.
Overall, Joseph Busha, I mean, you've got investors across sub-Saharan Africa. How do you think people are going to be viewing what's been going on in this country? I mean, there's been so much turmoil in the last few weeks. Now, all of a sudden, we've got this tough but hopeful budget. What do you think the reaction is going to be?
It was a very good way of summarizing it. Remember the President's Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address as well was try to balance and certainly bring lots of hope into South Africa. The big balancing act for me is possibly education. They have to carry on with the promise to make sure that education is accessible. But also what they've done in terms of the VAT increase is to make sure that there's zero-rated products that does not affect the poor. I think Mr. Mkoki is talking about the 52 cents increase. I think the biggest challenge in South Africa really is not that, but it's how it is administered. I think it's very inefficient because whenever oil price or the rand strengthens, every time, every 2 months we've got either an increase or a decrease, which really actually brings in more costs to the administration of fuel rather than to smooth it out. They had to find the money elsewhere, but otherwise Mr. Ramaphosa has to cut his executive quite significantly to make sure that there isn't much expenditure on executives and the money certainly goes to the poor.
Now, Tabile Wonte, I mean, you at the Black Management Forum, I mean, in some ways, I don't know whether you were surprised or happy about this large fund there is for black industrialists, which could change the entire game here in South Africa.
We actually appreciate the commitment that has been made by the minister towards bringing in more black industrialists into mainstream economy. Because when we talk about transformation, we always look at it from the top to say for the emerging as well as black business to tap into mainstream economy, number one, they've got to have a significant shareholding. They've got to own the businesses that they are in. And that's how really you get to transform the landscape. That's how you get to influence policy. And that's how you get to open up the space for more black-owned businesses to get into mainstream economy. So as the BMF, we really welcome that. And perhaps to add, where he mentioned when I was talking about the government's procurement policy, the commitment of ensuring that the SMMEs, in particular the ones that are owned by black entrepreneurs in townships, black women entrepreneurs, again, it speaks to my point on black industrialists to say there seems to be commitment in terms of ensuring that as we're talking about economic growth, but this growth is diversified and is transformed. Yeah.
Simodisa, as an entrepreneur as well, I mean, you must have, your heart must have jumped when you thought 1.4 billion to help entrepreneurs in this country, which I personally think is the future of the economy here. The question I have is, how do entrepreneurs get hold of this money? That's the question.
Well, to the contrary, my heart didn't jump because this is an amount of 1.5 billion rands, which is endorsed by the government, not contributed by the government.
So it's not enough.
Well, it's not that it's enough. It's just that it's a CEO's initiative that put together amongst big corporates in South Africa 1.5 billion rands towards high growth, high impact entrepreneurs. And the idea behind this was that government needs to come in to co-invest with the private sector. And so my question is, when is that going to happen? But however, this is money, this is capital that's now accessible, for startups, for us to seed ideas. And in essence, I think the government has to do a little bit more. Why don't you co-invest with the private sector? Because now this money has been collected. And while to talk to my colleague's point around procurement, yes, that 30% set aside, it's a great idea, but it has to be implemented well. How do we ensure that we leverage on public procurement to, assist small businesses and in essence ensure that it's something that does happen? But to echo what President Cyril Ramaphosa said in his State of the Nation address, I think entrepreneurs are quite enlightened by the fact that he's very committed. He wants to ensure that we nurture ideas, we nurture our startups, we provide funding for them. And to talk to your question around how do we access this 1.5 billion rands, well, it's a tough one because right now that's money that's not necessarily for pre-revenue entrepreneurs. Those guys that are looking for 100,000 rands, 150,000 rands, that fund is not going to fund them because they're looking for established businesses. And there's no shortage of capital in South Africa for businesses that are established, but there is a shortage of capital for ideas that are going to contribute towards the growth of our economy.
And those are the ideas that are going to make all our fortunes eventually. Alan, I mean, a lot has been said about this budget today already. Do you think it went far enough? I mean, a lot of people are talking about an austerity budget. We're talking about hard times. I admit, I think this VAT is going to hit the poor probably as a regressive tax.
Well, no, I don't think that it went far enough. It didn't go far enough because you have a problem. The problem is that you have to find a way of generating economic growth. And to that particular extent, there are things that you can actually do. The 1.4 billion, as Mati was saying, is money that belongs to the private sector. South Africa still lacks a wealth fund, which they themselves can use to generate a lot of economic activity and could be able to take a lot of much more higher risks. I don't think that the TFIs at this point in time are structured in a way in which they actually do support entrepreneurship. I think that they like to do things which are very safe and very sexy and very normal. It's very, very difficult to get any money from them at this point in time. They would rather put the money in the exchange than put money into these kinds of development things. So you do need South Africa that would create a wealth fund which is actually going to drive economic activity. 1.4 billion, 2.4 billion is not enough money. I've worked in banking all my life, and let me tell you, 2.4 billion disappears very, very, very quickly. And that's only like 2 or 3 projects. And we have so many thousands of entrepreneurs that actually need that particular assistance. I don't actually think that you can do that at less than 100 billion. You need a number somewhere thereabouts that can then generate that level of confidence and excitement that people want to bring their projects online. So that's a very, very key missing link in respect of capturing the idea of where, and also we didn't say anything about the growth of the infrastructure lines such as fiber optic and many, and we're still spending a lot of money on wrong things, wanting to build school buildings. I mean, we've moved now from buildings. We're in a digital world. That's where the money should actually be going into.
Sure. Mati, I mean, you as an entrepreneur, I mean, we talked about confidence just there. I mean, it's been a very, very turbulent few months in this country in politics and economics. Well, a year, if you look at the downgrades last year. As an entrepreneur, are you feeling a lot more confident tonight, maybe, than you were before?
Absolutely. I think for the past 3 months, it's very clear that there's a new sheriff in town. It is very, very clear that, by the rand increasing, there's a lot of positivity. And also we have a president who sounds like a custodian of entrepreneurship, and how do we nurture? How do we ensure that we give them funding? How do we ensure that we incubate them? How do we ensure that we subsidize? Because starting up is quite expensive. Rental in environments like this, which is where your clients are, the corporates, it's very, very expensive. So how do we ease the notion of people starting businesses by subsidizing some of the basics, but also talking to how do we open up procurement opportunities. We have triple BEE, which has failed. I mean, if we had to be very candid and honest around, has it really helped entrepreneurs in terms of supply and enterprise development? That's a lot of money that should be committed by corporates in South Africa. It's a huge industry, plus a billion rand industry, but we are still seeing unemployment rising. We just recently it went down to 26.7%, but for the longest of times, it has been a number that's going up and up, meaning that we are not supporting our entrepreneurs, our small businesses to be able to create those jobs. There's something that's wrong in the system, and I'm very hopeful and optimistic now that we have a president that actually gets it, understands it. He's a business person and he knows the challenges. And he's also invested in, let's say, Shanduka Black Umbrellas, which is a very good incubator in South Africa that subsidizes the start-up costs of any business.
Tabila, just to move on slightly to a slightly more political thing, Malus Kugaba, when he spoke today about how they were going to push ahead with state capture, there were some catcalls from the floor. Obviously, you know the backstory to that. But ultimately, there's a lot of turmoil to come in business. There's going to be people, by the looks of it, loaded into court. There's going to be all kinds of investigations. It's going to be a very difficult year ahead, I think, despite what's happened today. What do you think?
Part of the cleanup, the economic cleanup, also includes cleanup on governance. And we have dropped the ball over the past 10 years. Governance has really been trampled upon, and it's really incumbent upon the new sheriff in town to make it a point that all these drags, more especially that speaks to how the country goes forward, are severely dealt with. The rule of the law, that's one that has got to be respected by all. And it's one thing that as the BMF we strongly support, that let the law takes its course. However, all the people that have really brought our country down severely, those have got to be dealt with through the legitimate authoritative arm of the state.
Joseph, let's talk to you now. I mean, there's one thing about corruption that everyone forgets. For business, it adds a huge layer of unnecessary cost. Just looking at it here, how likely is it you think that it can be squeezed out of the system with the political will that we're now seeing?
No, certainly governance matters. I think we saw basically both in public and private last year, it was the highlight. So the highlight certainly was the state capture and Eskom and so on. And then we got the standoff issue and other corporates, what's happening at Resilient. So those do not help in terms of obviously moving the country forward. I think with GDP expectation of 1%, we won't be able to create jobs and so on. The only way to nib it in the bud is certainly to put people in jail. I think, I was here on Monday and I was saying one of the key issues we have basically seen is that Eskom since 2000 or 94 had about 16 CEOs, SABC the same. So even an average of about 1.5 years of a tenure of a CEO at all government entities that's supposed to deliver economic growth and services to the people. Land Bank was the same. So for me, I think President Ramaphosa needs to make sure that he is courageous and takes action and make sure that people face the law. We cannot get a country where you are engulfed in corruption scandals, from Travelgate to the Guptas now. So I hope that he is very committed to make sure that the cleanup is there, and that will send a message to corporates as well. It's not to say that corporates are not guilty or they are saints. There is a lot that's happening within the corporates, that is not making sure that South Africa goes ahead.
I'm afraid we've all had very busy days. We're running short of time on this program, but what I'd like to do before we close is to each of you just ask you very briefly what you took from today as a positive, and perhaps what your fear, your reservation is. Starting with you, Alan Makoki.
Well, I think that what I took from today was that there is a sense of urgency. I think that there is a sense of having captured that there is a problem, and therefore that particular problem will require us, all of us, to work together to actually fix it. I got a sense that the government is open to suggestions and that there is a level of, we don't know, come with us, let's work together, we need you. From a business point of view, I did get that particular element, and I think that on its own was encouraging. I think that there's a more level of receptiveness today in respect of the things that need to be done, whether austerity or otherwise, and I think that that's very, very encouraging. But we have no illusions about the fact that the budget today confirms that we are actually in trouble, and therefore we need to get out of this trouble.
Marty.
I think cohesion is very important. We've got great ambitions for our country. The budget did elaborate or speak to that, but it has to involve the public, private and civil society for this to happen. And then a sense of accountability. I think it's important that people are accountable for their actions. And then also it has to be an outcome-based or an output-based economy, whereby lots of investments is going into startups, but we need to start seeing jobs being created and unemployment becoming less and less. So I think those are the three things that are very, very key in order to make this happen and make this work.
Dabil.
From our side, the less reliance of the SOEs being bailed out by government, that's one of the things that are taking. And then the increase in taxes. South Africa is one of the highest countries that are tax burdened. I think we're in the top 10 in the world. And pushing through that deficit over to the citizens, it's a huge amount to absorb, and really you are literally pushing the citizens off the cliff. So it remains to be seen what's going to transpire out of this. However, bringing in more SOEs, black-owned businesses into mainstream economy, he spoke harshly on the evergreen contracts, which are gatekeeping because they are not opening up the space in those SOEs. So it's one of those things that we really appreciate. And obviously, as the BMF, we have rolled up our sleeves. We are going to work with the minister and his government to make this a reality.
I think for me the continuity in terms of positivity from the SONA, because I think there were threats that Minister Gigama won't be allowed to speak in Parliament, but I'm quite happy that I didn't watch it, but I'm happy that he did speak in Parliament. So that sense of unity, or to say let's give each other space and start again and move forward. So you can see that all the stakeholders, basically government, I'm sure Labour will come on, and certainly private sector getting together, that South Africa belongs to all of us. We have to work together so that we get it better.
Thank you very much. That's Joseph Busher, the MD of Busher Investments, Tabile Wondli, the Managing Director of the Black Management Forum, Simodisa, the Managing Director of Simodisa, and Alan Makoki, the CEO of SAC.